Oops, hold on. And I tell you about the work, the volunteer work that I did in Poland for Ukrainians. We're not advancing to my next slide. So that's, let's see here. Let me try to reshare here. I'm going to stop for a moment and get reset up again. Share. No, we're not advancing. Oh, there's always technical difficulties now, aren't there? Okay, let's try again. Are you seeing my screen? How about that?
Yes.
Yes,
Physically
we have
you're
it.
showing.
Have
Mhm.
it.
Okay, perfect. So before I jump in, I just wanted to share that my views and thoughts are mine alone. And tonight I do not represent any organization or its employees or its affiliates. And understandably, for the ongoing safety and security of operations in Poland, I cannot disclose exact locations. And for the privacy and confidentiality of Ukrainians, I cannot disclose their names. And so I've changed names to protect them. So tonight I want to tell you about my medical relief work in Poland to improve the health and quality of life for Ukrainians who have escaped the war in Ukraine, and tell you about what I observed, the most common acute and chronic medical conditions from which they suffer, and provide some recommendations for how we together can sustain humanitarian relief and medical support. Natalia already told you all about me, and I'm thrilled to be here. I want to tell you why this is so important to me. Like I'm sure all of you, on February 24, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I was angry and sad and crying, and I felt so helpless. And I realized that I needed to pretty quickly harness those emotions and do something to help. And as a registered nurse, the best way I know how to help is through nursing. Because to me, the very heart of nursing is helping people when they are at their weakest. I'm also always thinking about and so grateful for the courage of my grandparents as they fled Ukraine during World War II in this very similar experience that our Ukrainians are feeling now. So the purpose of my medical relief work was to support existing Polish disaster relief operations. Poland is very advanced in the EU, of course. So I looked forward to working alongside Polish providers and under the direction of the Polish government to provide medical relief. I also was so fortunate to gather cash donations. My healthcare colleagues, friends, and family, many who are on the call tonight, so thank you so much for your support, generously donated over $20,000 US, which I directly was able to provide to our Ukrainian community in Poland. I purchased medications, medical supplies, and other much in need supplies to help them. The Ukrainian refugees with whom I worked in Poland are guests of Poland. And this comes directly from Polish President Andrzej Duda. He refers to them as guests, as everybody does throughout Poland, everywhere from the hotels and restaurants and the Uber drivers, they are guests of Poland. And I was fortunate to serve babies as young as 2 months and individuals as old as 90. And they were from all over Ukraine. Now, I was there for 3 weeks, mid-April through early May. And the individuals at that time that were escaping Ukraine were in a very poor condition. So it appeared and that these individuals had not left right away when the invasion started. Many were very poor and didn't have the means to escape, or they thought perhaps, this won't last very long and there's no reason to leave Ukraine and my home. But the individuals with whom I was working, many of them were from areas that were already Russian occupied or had been hit very heavily. So they had no choice but now to leave. And many of them had suffered losses of their family members. Of course, primarily they were women and children, because men between the ages of 18 and 60 are not permitted to leave. Of course, there were orphans, entire orphanages that were evacuated, and I'll tell you about that. There were many individuals that were disabled and that were wheelchair bound, and were very sick that their families did not leave behind. And there were pets, there were dogs and cats, families who wouldn't leave their loved one, their little furry friends behind. I volunteered most of my time in a massive refugee transit center in Warsaw, Poland. And it was run by the Polish government with hundreds of multinational volunteers from all over the world. And I'd never experienced anything like this. It's really unprecedented, and the complexity and the scale of operations. At the time that I was at this massive refugee transit center, there were 7,000 guests, with the ability to host up to 10,000 people. It was really interesting and awesome to see the Canadian immigration on site, and they were processing authorizations for temporary and permanent residents. So that was quite wonderful to see, the strong presence of Canada. The United States was not there. World Central Kitchen provided food, and it was awesome. We ate there as well as the guests of Poland. So they offered 3 hot meals a day, cafeteria style. There were also abundant grab and go bags that families could take with them if they were boarding a bus and moving on, or if they didn't, like what was being served in the cafeteria that day. There were also food trucks, and this was a really big hit with the teenagers. There were hamburgers and pizzas and coffee drinks and fried donuts and food trucks, and all of this was operationalized and supported by World Central Kitchen. It's really amazing to see. There were abundant amounts of clothing and shoes and diapers and toys. There was a designated area about the size of half a football field with just piles and mountains of donated clothing. So it was really evident that donated clothing was not needed. There were play areas and classrooms for all different ages of children. There was a teen center where teenagers could just hang out, and they played music, and they danced, and they played computer games, or they could do their homework on laptops. The children continued their studies via the internet, and there were areas where they could play ball or do yoga. There was reading time and arts and crafts. So there was lots of great organized structure for children. And there was a vet clinic, and it was staffed by volunteer veterinarians, and there was food and litter boxes and leashes and carriers so that families could keep their furry friends secure. I met one of the veterinarians. He was very kind, and he told me that he had never served or treated, so many urinary tract infections in dogs and cats because the pets were really dehydrated and they had to hold their bladder on their journey. So that was very interesting to me. And I saw several pets who had little casts on their arms or legs where they had sustained an injury. So in this massive transit center, I volunteered in a very busy medical clinic. It was huge and it was exceptionally busy. It was operating 24/7. So there was a constant stream of individuals who would come to the medical clinic. Oversight was provided by the Polish government and Polish licensed independent practitioners, which I was really pleased with. They truly had exceptional standards, just as we do in the US. And this clinic was staffed primarily by Polish, American, and Canadian clinicians. So there were physicians and PAs and NPs, medics, nurses, dentists, oral surgeons, a variety of medical professionals who had volunteered, and we're all working together side by side just to make it happen. We worked long 12-hour shifts. Some people would work the night shift. I luckily was assigned the day shift, but everybody was working super hard to serve the never-ending line of individuals who would come for medical care and dental care. There was also optometrist and pharmacists with a really well-stocked pharmacy. And the pharmacy, all the medications and vaccines and IV fluids and such, they were either provided by the Polish government or donated by international medical relief volunteers or the organization. So there was just a massive supply of medications, and the need was great indeed. Now, for individuals who presented acutely ill and maybe signs and symptoms of a heart attack, for instance, who clearly needed to be transferred to hospital, the Polish EMS was on standby, and that happened several times a day. And so they would quickly take that individual to hospital. So let me tell you a little bit about International Medical Relief. They are an awesome global nonprofit organization. They are based in Colorado, and they provide free health and dental care around the world. They have worked in 78 countries and have provided disaster relief, such as what is being provided in Poland, in 19 countries around the world and also in the US. They partner with in-country hosts. So I think this is an important aspect. They are not there to reinvent the wheel or get in the way. They come in and serve under the direction of existing healthcare systems. They develop partnerships and training opportunities in many countries and work on water and sanitation development. But again, the work in Poland is for Ukrainian disaster relief. And their motto is first in and last out. They arrived just weeks after the Russians invaded Ukraine, and they will stay as long as they're able, as long as Americans continue to volunteer. So I was with a large team of volunteer professionals all across the US, literally everywhere. There were Alaska, Hawaii, East Coast, West Coast, and everywhere in between. A variety of ages of volunteers. There were volunteers in their mid-20s, nurses, and there were some volunteers, an oral surgeon who had been retired for a few years, so everywhere in between. It was a real pleasure and honor to get to know these very giving volunteers. I was the only Ukrainian speaker, the only one of Ukrainian descent on my team. There were individuals who would come to help translate. Of course, that was needed for all of the English-speaking volunteers. Most of the volunteer translators were Ukrainian refugees themselves, and some were, better than others, but everybody worked together to make it happen. So in this very busy clinic, individuals would get in line. And if they appeared sick, we would, pull them up quickly to the front of the line. And there was a triage and an intake area where we would, with the help of an interpreter, get some basic information about them. What was their chief complaint? Then a nurse would collect their vital signs and any other additional tests that we thought were needed for that individual at that time. They would see a licensed independent practitioner, either a doctor or a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. They would quickly make an assessment and determine what was needed for that individual at that time. And then the pharmacy, as I said, was fairly well stocked, so they would receive their medications or treatment because some individuals needed wound treatment or maybe some additional testing. Health education is a really important integral part of mission work and really important to international medical relief. And it is such a core element to help Ukrainians understand how they can help themselves, even in this very stressful and difficult situation, to empower individuals to take their health into their own hands. So we spent a lot of time on health education. For me, it was really important to spend a lot of time on infection prevention and control, with thousands of people in this massive transit center, for folks to understand the importance of hand hygiene, and they were provided hand hygiene gel, as well as masks, to try to decrease the transmission of respiratory illness. As well, medication compliance was an important education point. You know, the importance of completing your antibiotic course, not sharing your antibiotics, returning to clinic if you were not improving. Nutrition and hydration, you know, again, even though it's an incredibly stressful time, how important it is to try to make healthier choices and eat 3 meals a day. The food that was provided was nutritious and delicious. I ate it and it was really good. And so I was super grateful for that. And hydration. And we provided everybody with oral hydration packs, you know, like a Gatorade mix and Pedialyte mix, you know, to be sure that folks stayed well hydrated. In human trafficking, this was really important. You know, human trafficking includes sex trafficking, prostitution. It includes labor bondage, and it includes forced labor, such as farming or working as a nanny. So it was really important because Ukrainian refugees are at high risk for human trafficking, young and old, male and female. So I spent a lot of time talking to individuals about that and how to protect themselves and others. Let me tell you a few stories. Artem was a 17-year-old, and I will think of him always. And he was really thin. He was a young man who was diagnosed with pneumonia. He told me that he escaped his home when it was struck by missiles and that he was all alone. He had no family with him. His parents were still in Ukraine, and he was in contact with them, and they were telling him to come back home. And he said he didn't want to go home because he didn't want to die. So he was soon to be 18. So his plan was to stay in the transit center until he was 18, and then he was going to move on to the Netherlands. We treated him with antibiotics, oral hydration, and vitamins. I spent a lot of time with him discussing human trafficking. And he was so kind. I would see him every day, and my heart continues to think about Artem, and I hope he's okay. Many of the acute medical conditions that we treated included respiratory and GI illness. There was a lot of respiratory pneumonia, bacterial and viral infections, bronchitis, and exacerbations of asthma. So we were able to treat individuals with antibiotics, and we also had nebulizer treatments and meter dose inhalers for individuals. We were able to restart individuals on medications that they may have been taking at home for asthma. GI illness, there was a lot of vomiting and diarrhea, dehydration, and weight loss. People were just thin. They had been on long journeys to get there. Some of them, you know, had left their homes and hid somewhere in basements and in horrible conditions and continued west. So they may have been on their journey for many weeks before they got to Poland. And there were traumatic injuries and wounds. Some folks may have received medical care, some may not. So there were many wounds that were grossly infected that needed to be debrided and cleansed and packed, and the wound dressings changed. So some individuals, we would have them come back twice a day or daily so that we could clean and dress their wounds and monitor that. And as I mentioned, it was not uncommon for there to be acute cardiac events. So we would watch out for that and triage, and the Polish EMS would jump into action and take those folks directly to hospital. I want to tell you about Natalia. Natalia was a young mother with 2 small children, Oksana and Dmitro. Oksana was about 10, Dmitro was about 5. And she tells me that they escaped from her village that had just recently become Russian occupied. And her husband, they decided he would stay behind and fight. She was quiet and the children were very sick. Natalia was dazed and withdrawn and a little weepy. And she said it was taking her everything she had just to be strong for her children. The children, as I said, were really sick. They had high fevers, GI illness, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, and lethargy. So we treated the children with IV fluids immediately and antiemetics. They were also given Pedialyte oral hydration packets and vitamins and some pediatric acetaminophen to bring down their fevers. And the clinicians monitored them frequently. So this was not unusual. When people were sick, but did not need to be transferred to hospital, we would round on them. So there was always individuals who were assigned rounding, and they would go and check in on people and their children to make sure they were improving, make sure they had everything that they needed. And Oksana and Dmitro did improve. I was so happy to see that. One day I just came and I was like, wow, they're up, and they're smiling. And it was just so beautiful to see that they had improved. And she talked about taking a bus to Estonia. So Natalia had friends from her village who had already traveled to Estonia. So she was eager and was getting her name on the list to take a bus to Estonia. We saw many individuals with behavioral health conditions, some that had suffered from mental illness previously and some new conditions. So of course, lots of anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress, which included tearfulness, inability to sleep and eat, and tremors, and being very withdrawn. One thing that really struck me is, in this massive transit center with thousands of people, it wasn't very loud, not like I would expect or have ever seen in the US for sure. People were just so shocked and withdrawn that it wasn't very noisy. And that will just always resonate and sit with me. There were many individuals who presented with known mood disorders, including schizophrenia, or who presented with addiction. And many people, may or may not have admitted it, but, we treated them symptomatically. There were individuals with dementia. For folks who had known psychiatric illness, many of them knew their medications, which was great, or had them written down with them, and they were out of their medications. And we had a nice supply of psychotropics, so we were able to restart them. There was a psychiatrist as well at the transit center. And for Ukrainians with dementia, there was a special unit, a room that was designated for 24/7 care. And usually their family members would stay with them if they had family with them. And there was always 2 clinicians. The Canadians were so kind, and they always took the night shift. And they would watch closely over these individuals who suffered from dementia or other sorts of chronic illnesses that really needed close monitoring. There were many cancer patients, for instance. So again, they weren't needing the higher level of care of a hospital, but they definitely needed to be observed. Let me tell you about Ivan. He was a younger man in his 20s, and he had a known history of schizophrenia. And he tells me that he had escaped his village when it was attacked by missiles. And during that escape, he was separated from his family. And he had with him his list of medications. And yet he didn't have his medications with him. And so I'm so happy that we were able to restart him on his meds. And he was quickly connected with Polish services so that a safer home placement, a smaller home placement could be found for him where he could be supervised. There was an American nurse practitioner on our team who had a lot of experience with psychiatric patients, and he spent hours with Ivan, and it was, oh, just so beautiful to see the gentle patience of an American sitting with a schizophrenic Ukrainian who needed some time to tell his story. Really beautiful. Chronic medical conditions that were most common were diabetes, asthma, COPD, hypertension, heart arrhythmias, CHF, and cancer. So no surprises here. So many diabetics presented and said, I feel okay, but I'm out of my meds. So, can you help me? Or I'm out of my blood glucose strips. I can't check my blood sugar. So we had lots of blood glucose meters and strips that we could give them, and quite a nice stash of oral medications for diabetics. We even had insulins for those who needed it. For asthmatic patients, again, we had meter dose inhalers and medications. We could give nebulizer treatments if they needed that, as well for the COPD patients. Hypertension, we had all kinds of meds, cardiac meds and antihypertensives. CHF, we even had diuretics. So it was a great and well-stocked pharmacy. For cancer patients, we treated their symptoms. If they needed to, they were sent to hospital to resume chemotherapy or radiation treatments that were interrupted. This picture, medical professionals on the call will appreciate that. You can see, a non-healing wound, and this is just an example of how individuals would come every day and get their wounds treated. Katya, let me tell you about Katya. She was a beautiful woman, and I'm going to try not to cry. She was a retired school teacher and had hypertension and was diagnosed with a pretty troublesome pneumonia. And she tells me that she escaped her apartment when it was struck by missiles. And in that, her sister died. And she lived with her sister, and it was just her and her sister. And she had been at the transit center for almost 2 months and said that she had nowhere to go and nowhere to turn to. It was just her and her sister in her life. And I asked her what her plan was, and she said, I just want to go home. I don't have a plan. So she was treated with antihypertensives, antibiotics, multivitamins, oral electrolyte solution, and new reading glasses. So Katya, as a retired school teacher, her glasses were so broken, one of the lenses was shattered, and she kind of taped it together. And so we got her a new pair of glasses, and she cried. I mean, imagine the joy of being able to see again, right? And how disorienting it would be to not be able to see well. So I visited Katya every day. She just really pulled at my heartstrings, and I just fell in love with her a little bit more every day. It was really hard to say goodbye. There were many mothers and babies, of course. There were some women that were told that they were pregnant. We had pregnancy tests. Some of them were a little suspicious, and so we were delivering some beautiful news at probably the hardest time of their life. There were many newborns and infants, and many moms that were breastfeeding. Anytime we saw babies less than 12 months of age, we worked really hard to get them placed in hotels. I am a Marriott customer for life because they gave away so many hotel rooms. It's hard to get a hotel room in Poland right now, and it is because they are giving away those hotel rooms to Ukrainians. And many local hotels, of course, as well. At one point, I was asked if I could go to another place, another accommodation, because they wanted to give away my room to Ukrainians, which of course I was like, yeah, I mean, we'll sleep on a cot. We were happy to do that. And it's so important, just to be clear, why we wanted those little babies out of there is to protect them from a respiratory and GI illness, which would be devastating to a newborn baby. Let me tell you about Prytula and Olena. They had been married for a few years. They were a young couple. And Prytula was a citizen of another country. And 2 days before Russia invaded, they gave birth to baby Marko, a beautiful and healthy baby. So Prytula, who was a professional, knew that it was time to escape. So they fled to Western Ukraine. And luckily, they were able to expedite a passport for their baby. And they were able to leave Ukraine. And they were in Warsaw. Olena was definitely suffering from post-traumatic stress. She was very withdrawn and weepy. She was successfully breastfeeding, but Prytula was really holding her up, and he was so amazing. He would literally wrap his arms around her as she breastfed the baby. So Prytula brought Olena and baby Marko to clinic because they were worried about Marko, and I'm so glad that they did, because we saw this, beautiful 2-month-old baby. And we needed to get them out of there quickly. And within hours, literally just a few hours, Marriott gave them a free hotel room. And that included 3 meals a day. And they were so delighted. They had sent me pictures when they got in their hotel room. And it was the first time I'd ever seen Olena smile. So it was really beautiful to see. We also assured that Olena was connected with a Polish psychiatrist. She was given antidepressants straight away and postnatal vitamins. But importantly, she was connected with Polish healthcare for ongoing treatment of what appeared to be, post-traumatic stress, postpartum stress. Another beautiful woman that I'll always think about is Ludmila, and she was a middle-aged nurse. And she was there with her adult daughter, Ivanka, and her infant grandchild, Andriko. So they were all healthy. And I met them because they came for glasses. Ludmila's eyeglasses were broken. And she tells me that they escaped their city when it was attacked by bombs and missiles. They had stayed for a long time after their city had been attacked. As a nurse, she felt that her hospital needed her, that she had to stay there to help out. But then the hospital was struck and destroyed, and people died in that attack. And she said, I realized that I needed to save my daughter and my grandson. So it was time to go. Her husband and her son-in-law had stayed behind to fight the Russians. And it was very difficult, as she told me, that she hadn't heard from her husband in some time. So most of the time I spent in the massive transit center in the medical clinic, but I also spent a week in an orphanage, and that was in another city in Poland, and that was a really beautiful experience. This orphanage was from Boyarka, Kyiv Regional Orphanage, and they've given me permission to share all the details that I provide you tonight. They were relocated shortly after the invasion to a beautiful facility. It was secluded and it was in the woods, and they were provided this sort of hotel retreat, and it was lovely. And the Polish government was taking care of the building, providing security for the building, as well managed all the food and the kitchen operations. So that was fantastic. It was very secure. It was a very nice place. There was even a massive playground for the children. There were 120 orphans, ages 2 months to 7 years. Most of them were healthy, but there were definitely children who had severe cognitive or physical disabilities. When the orphanage relocated from Kyiv, only 13 of their orphanage staff came with them. Other individuals have their own families, they weren't able to go. So when they arrived in Poland, they recruited volunteers from the Ukrainian refugee community and, offered, you can stay here and, for free with your children, of course, but we need your help taking care of these orphans. And there were many women with their children who stepped up to that call of duty and did that. So it was really beautiful to see that. They had approximately 25 volunteers. I spent a lot of time with the medical and the nursing administrative directors there, and I found them to be dedicated, incredibly hardworking. They worked very long hours. They looked exhausted every day, as I know they were. They never, of course, had a day off by any means. And they were really transparent in their operations. And, I didn't ask to see, their books or anything like that, but they were very eager to show me how they were operating. And I was just so grateful for that. They showed me, and I saw all the time that I was there, an abundant supply of donated clothing and strollers and toys and diapers. And, they repeatedly let me know, we don't need those things. There was actually a conference room where they stored incoming donations. And it was stacked to the ceiling. And they said, we don't even have enough staff to unpack this. We don't need any more diapers. We have wonderful and delicious food, but what we do need is money. So Lesia was one of the, she was one of the staff that came from Kiev, from the orphanage in Kiev. And she was assigned to take care of 3 infants. There was a set of twins and another baby, and they were all less than 6 months of age. And so she was in a small room with a twin bed for herself and 3 cribs for the 3 babies. And she takes care of these babies 24/7. There is no backup. There's no one coming to give her a break. And so Lesia had left her own adolescent children in Ukraine with her parents. And she sometimes was really tearful when she said, how much she missed her own children and hoped that they were okay. And that she wanted to go home. She had been there over 2 months at this point, but she just couldn't possibly leave these babies that they needed her so much. So I provided sort of respite care. I would come in and take care of the babies for a few hours so that Lesia could take a nap or take a shower so she could call her family in Ukraine. And I did that for 2 staff every day. So I would, but I have to say, I had 1 baby at a time, and that was an incredible amount of work. I can't even imagine taking care of 3 babies at the same time. And they were such beautiful children. They were so well cared for. They were immaculately clean, well-dressed, well-fed. The facility was immaculately taken care of with really strict security, which is so important to me, of course, and to all of us. But so every single day, even the last day that I had volunteered, and I'd already been coming every single day for a week, every day I had to, go to the front desk, sign in, call the nursing administrative director, and she would come down and greet me. And I was so grateful for that. They, in addition, at the transit center and at the orphanage, before I could volunteer, I had to provide my professional nursing license, medical insurance, professional liability insurance, and certifications. And for my healthcare colleagues, you'll get a kick out of this. I sent them my RN license, and they said, well, gee, thank you, but we need to check that with the primary source. So can we please have the hyperlink to the Illinois Board of Nursing where you are licensed? And I said, of course. And I was so grateful for that. So they wanted me to share this with you, this information from Boyatka Kiev Regional Orphanage. They were established in 1959. As I shared with you, their staffing right now is their critical need, and their goal is to raise money to take care of the children. So they are seeking cash donations. They asked that I share with you, if you're interested, their legacy Facebook site, so you can see pictures of them and the work that they're doing, as well as their Polish bank fund, where individuals could send donations if you're interested or able. And we know that there are many, many such orphanages that were relocated and displaced in Poland and the EU. This is just the one in which I volunteered. So to wrap up my presentation, overall, the unprecedented scale and complexity of operations was just awesome. And I really must say it was some of the hardest, emotionally and even physically, some of the hardest work that I've ever done, but I can't wait to do it again. Poland is an exceptionally beautiful and generous, compassionate country and welcoming to the Ukrainian refugees. Everywhere I went, from the Uber drivers to the hotels, everybody seemed to be rowing in the same direction. I mean, the country is really, it's all hands on deck. And Ukrainians are so brave and determined and humble and gracious and grateful. Everybody thanked for all the volunteer work and anything that they were given. Everybody was so thankful and expressed that in a variety of ways. So my recommendations are to donate money. Think about establishing monthly recurring donations, raising money in your communities, ask for matching donations from your employer. My recommendation is that cash is best for sustained relief and recovery, that it's fast and flexible, and it provides organizations an opportunity to direct those funds where it's needed, when it's needed, at exactly the right time. So I recommend that we not send unsolicited material donations. So for sure, if you are working with an organization and they've requested, as I know the great work of UNWA, medvacs or woundvacs, right? For sure, that is solicited, there's a need and there's a plan. But I saw many examples of unsolicited medications and supplies that were expired or were things that would not be useful, like an entire crate of extra large latex gloves. Like extra large is a size that's not really used very much. So that's unfortunate. It really just clogs supply chain. Ukraine and the EU have advanced healthcare systems, and they have very rigorous standards, just like we do in the US. So to best support humanitarian aid and relief, let's not send unsolicited supplies and think about how we can raise more money. Now there are many, many excellent nonprofit organizations. These are just a few that I believe in that receive my donations. Of course, all of you from UNWA and the amazing work that you're doing. Here is International Medical Relief. If you know healthcare workers and clinicians, if you are interested, please go to their website, give them a call. They're based in Colorado. There's lots of information on their website. They're also looking for some non-healthcare volunteers. So maybe you're interested in that, especially if you're Ukrainian speaking. It would be a tremendous gift to operations in their transit center. So with that, I'll take a breath. And are there any questions?
So Lisa, before we go to the questions, first let me say thank you so much for the service in the first instance, and secondly for really fleshing out and bringing to life the experience that you had there, both on a macro level and then on that more intimate personal level. It really just told the story in a way that I've not heard before, so very much appreciate that. I'm going to stop